Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky is gearing up to visit the White House Friday to ink a minerals deal with the US. The two sides appear to have patched up their differences following public pushback from Kyiv. The government is now saying it's given its agreement after Washington backed off on its controversial demand for Ukraine to hand over $500 billion worth of revenue from its mineral resources to the United States. Charlotte Lamb has more now on the terms of the deal.
One step closer to potential agreement. US President Donald Trump says Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky will visit the White House Friday to sign a critical minerals deal.
And we're going to be signing an agreement, which will be a very big agreement. And I want to thank Howard and Scott for the job you guys did in putting it together.
Key details have not been made public, but Zelensky says he is still seeking security guarantees.
This agreement could be part of the future security guarantees, but I want to make sure an agreement is an agreement. We need to understand the broader vision, what lies next for Ukraine, where we are in all of this.
This deal is at the heart of Kyiv's attempt to gain support from the US. It would see Ukraine contribute half the future revenues from its natural resources to a fund, in which the US would own the maximum interest allowed by its own domestic law. Ukraine has 100 major deposits, including 20 out of the 50 minerals considered critical to the US economy, most of whose production is currently dominated by China. Among them, titanium, lithium, uranium, and significant reserves of rare earth minerals. Many of those rare earth deposits, though, lie in territory already captured by Russia. Trump says he's not opposed to dealing with Moscow on future mineral deals. Outside the US Embassy in Kyiv, activists are protesting the potential deal. These anti-Trump signs implying Trump is on Putin's side.
It's not right to blackmail the country at war and force it to sign any deal that is not economically beneficial.
Many say an agreement can only be signed once Russia's aggression stops.
Let's speak more on this. Mark Temnycky, who is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, joins us now. Mark, it's great to have you. Thanks so much for joining us on the programme. We're still in the dark about the final details of this deal. We know that there's this joint fund that's going to be set up, but the deal doesn't, of course, include any security guarantees. Tell us, in your view, do you think Kyiv is being shortchanged here?
Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure to be back on France 24. That is something that a lot of Ukrainians back in Ukraine are very concerned about, where the United States says that it's very interested in the mineral deposits and reserves that the Ukrainians have, which is equated, some news outlets say, tens of trillions of dollars worth of material and things that they can mine. But the Ukrainians don't see anything in return. Yes, the United States has claimed that the Ukrainians and the United States would work together to create some sort of reconstruction fund, but there's nothing there in the current deals that we know of where there are security guarantees or discussions about the United States continuing to provide defense equipment to the Ukrainians to ensure that they can protect themselves from an ongoing Russian attack. So currently, it is very odd why the Ukrainians would pursue such a deal with the United States.
Well, the US has very much portrayed this as being, a deal where it's going to make lots of money from, it's going to get a lot of resources through. But these minerals, getting them will be a hard and expensive process, won't they?
Yes, certainly. First of all, a lot of the minerals and resources that are available are in the occupied territories that Russia illegally has control over in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. Second of all, a lot of this infrastructure does not yet exist, and that will cost a lot of money to build what is required in order to refurbish equipment that they have and then start mining and pulling out these resources in the area. So it's very unclear how this deal would go forward.
And you mentioned that, that many of these mineral deposits are located in areas occupied by Russia. Tell us how you think Washington and Kyiv are going to navigate that. Russia has said that it's willing to give the US access to those mineral reserves in exchange for Washington dropping sanctions that it's put against Moscow. Tell us how you think Washington is going to navigate the sort of complication with Russia owning parts of Ukraine.
Russia's trying to be very assertive in the statement, saying that but this is territory that is not legally theirs. It's still part of Ukraine. And by coming up with some sort of agreement with the Russians for minerals in the Russian-occupied areas of eastern Ukraine, that would effectively acknowledge Ukrainian territory as being seized by Russians, and the Russians should not be rewarded for this horrible war that they began not only in 2022 with the full-scale invasion, but the illegal annexation of Crimea in the spring of 2014, as well as the attacks that occurred in the Donbass shortly afterwards. The United States is working closely with Ukraine, as there have been reports recently that President Zelensky himself will be in the United States this coming Friday to discuss the deal further and come up with the final areas within the deal. President Zelensky said that he still wants some sort of security, sort of other possibility to ensure that Ukraine would be protected from the Russians, and the Ukrainians continue to their allies to work together, because they should not be treating Russia as some sort of equal partner, as the Russians are capable of doing a lot of atrocities in these areas, and they're responsible for the war. So the Russians should not be rewarded with some sort of financial agreement or making additional income from Ukrainian territory because they illegally took it over.
Mark, we are having some connection issues, but we're going to try and push through with you. I wanted to ask you, do you feel that this sets a precedent? Do you think going forward we're going to see, not just Ukraine, but Europe, NATO, likely to get less security guarantees from the US if it doesn't offer something in return, like financial compensation? Do you think this is a trend we're likely to see going forward from the Trump administration?
The Ukrainians are treading lightly as they understand that the Trump administration, with Vice President Vance as well, and that the aid to Ukraine has been expensive. They want to repay American taxpayers for the amount of money that has been provided to the Ukrainians. It's very important to state that of the $175 billion that the United States has provided to Ukraine during the 3-year period, only $75 billion of that aid has been sent to Ukraine. A lot of those are weapons that the United States no longer uses. So of the $100 billion that is on paper, that's actually being used within the United States to help employ Americans and refurbish American stockpiles, helping with acquisition within the United States. And the Ukrainians have also pushed that not only do they want security guarantees, but they also want to ensure that economic penalties and other forms of sanctions remain within Russia, so that if sanctions immediately would not allow Russia to continue attacking, and that would be another type of buffer to put on the Russians at this time.
And more widely, I think...
The European Union is also exploring ways...
Please go on.
Sorry?
Please go on.
The European Union is also exploring how they can use Russian seized assets, because they're concerned that the United States is starting to pull away its support for Ukraine. Of course, no one is certain how things will unfold after this deal is signed, but they're looking for other contingency plans in case the United States starts to slowly tread away from the European continent.
And just one last question for you. I think it can be argued that we're slowly seeing this shift away from an international rules-based order. We're seeing, Washington moving away from this moral stand against Russia. It's doing that in favor of more transactional diplomacy, I think it can be argued. Tell us what sort of impact you feel that this sort of shift is going to have now.
It puts a lot of questions into alliances that currently exist, where it's based through diplomacy and international norms and doing the moral right thing. And now it seems that in some capacity there are trade agreements where someone is becoming a client state and no longer being held on a of relations with these countries. And also we're seeing a shift in how the United Nations resolution recently voted against the ongoing Russian aggression and trying to determine how to maintain this international world order, because if the Russians are allowed to maintain the territory that they have in Ukraine, then at that point international norms and rules no longer matter, because then authoritarians can do whatever they want to without consequence.
Mark, it was great to get your insight. Thanks so much for joining us on the program. We did have those connection issues, but we pushed through and got to the end of that interview. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you again for having me.